Hello, and welcome to our Sunday school class on Romans chapter 7 as part of our Sunday School in Exile series. This video is actually going to be a little different from others because the way Romans 7 is set up, me going through verse by verse doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What I want to do instead is I kind of want to give you some of the ideas in Romans 7 and then encourage you to do the reading on your own and see if they can help you make sense of the chapter in a new way. All right, so let's talk about some of the big themes going on in Romans 7. The first thing you need to know about Romans 7 is it can be broken up into two big parts. So the first 6 verses are kind of a continuation or a summary of what's been going on in chapter 5 and chapter 6. So the Apostle Paul is talking about kingdoms still, and about what happens when you die to the kingdom of sin and are reborn in the kingdom of life. And so as you read verses 1 through 6, read them just like we read through Romans 6. And I'd encourage you to rewatch that video if you're having any trouble with that. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of decode some of the ideas in Romans 7 that are going to help us make sense of these verses. And the first one I want to start with is the law. Now, it's mentioned over and over again in these verses. And we've talked about before how when Paul uses the word law in Romans, what he means is the Torah, the Old Testament laws, the laws given to the Jewish people by God at Mount Sinai. That's the Torah. And it has all these rules and regulations that we are familiar with from reading our Old Testaments that are part of it. That's the Torah. That's the law. Now, our Bible translations are sometimes working against us when we read this chapter because the way things are translated doesn't make it seem like it's talking about the Torah. It seems like maybe it's talking about some kind of general principle at work. But I don't think it is. I really don't. I think it's always talking about Torah. But you can see what I mean by our Bible translations working against us in verse 21, for example, where my NIV reads, "I find this law at work." The word "this" isn't there. The word is "the." It's changed to "this." And it's changed that way because the person who is translating the Bible thought that it was a general principle, didn't want you to be confused, and so changed "the" to "this," kind of making it sound like a general law or a general principle. But I think that those translations are incorrect. And I say that humbly, but I think that that's the case. I think that that should say "the." And in Romans 7, every time Paul talks about the law, he's talking about the Torah. Because there's this thing happening with the Torah. There's this paradox that Paul is talking about. A paradox is two truths that seem to be in conflict with each other, but are actually true. The paradox is that Paul is saying the law is good, but it's caused bad, okay? Or it's been used for bad. So we can't be led down the path of thinking that the Torah is a bad thing. It's good. And so the Gentiles in Rome can't criticize or attack their Jewish brothers and sisters based on the Torah, because the Torah is good. The problem is it's been used by sin to cause death. And Paul's going to talk about what's happening there. But he's actually going to go through the passage in Romans 7. He's going to go through the process of exonerating the Torah. But you're going to see sometimes it looks like he's saying the Torah is good, and sometimes it looks like he's saying the Torah is bad. But he's not. This is really important. The Torah is good, but it's been used for bad. Okay, let's move on. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is the big thing. There's this "I" all the way through Romans 7 through 25. And the most natural way for us to read it is as us, right? Paul's talking about himself and all of us. And I really want you to hear this. I think that that's an okay reading. I think that we can do that. I know that I see myself when I read these passages that way. And I think some of that is autobiographical for Paul, right? I think that what he's talking about isn't him, but I think he can relate to what he's talking about. So I want to start by saying that if you read Romans 7 and you find comfort because you realize that Paul knows what you're going through when he wrestles with the sin within himself, I want to tell you, you can go ahead and do that. You can keep reading it that way. In fact, Pastor Ben and I, in our conversation at the end of the video, kind of take that on and talk about it, how we can relate to the I in Romans 7. So I want you to know you can keep that perspective. It's okay. So if I doesn't mean me, then who's Paul talking about? Well, I think that Paul is talking about Israel. I think that he's referring to the people of God, and he's kind of standing in their place. And he does that for a couple of reasons. We know that later on in Romans, he's going to make sure that he's clear that he considers himself one of the Jews, that he's one with them, that he identifies with them. And he doesn't want to create a distance between them and him, so he's kind of putting all of them together in this I. Sometimes in ancient literature, people would do this. They would take on a group and they would address the group they would talk about the group as though they were talking about themselves. And that was a way of showing solidarity with that group. So that's what I think Paul is doing here. And what that's going to actually do is it's going to help us to go through the verses bit by bit, kind of plugging that idea in and reading the story of Israel all the way through. For example, you see that Paul's hinting at or talking about the golden calf in verses 9 and 10 in the story of Exodus. But then he connects it to the serpent, I think, in verse 11. Now, he doesn't say any of this outright, right? It's all kind of subtle and behind the scenes. Now, you might think that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You might think that that's not the obvious way to read the passage, and that's okay. You don't have to think that. I'm pretty confident of it, and I do have a couple of more reasons for that, but I don't want to bore you. I'd be glad to talk to you about it. If you'd like to dig deeper into whether this is Israel or an individual Christian, there's a lot of things to look at. But what I want to encourage you to do instead, or at least first, is to read through these passages and put, first of all, yourself in the I, and just kind of see how you can relate to it, because I think that you will. I certainly do. And then I want you to read through them again, and I want you to put Israel in place for the I, and see how it just kind of tells the story of what happens with God's people accepting the Torah. Because remember that the law causes sin. It's used for bad purposes. And you can kind of read the struggle that Israel has with their identity as God's people because of the sin that they have and the way it uses the law against them. Now, one last thing before you dive into Romans 7 and read on your own. I really want you to hear this. One of the common ways we've read Romans 7 is about the foolishness of trying to earn your way into heaven, because we're all deeply guilty. I think that we have to be really careful, because I just don't think that that's what Paul is doing here at all. There is something to the fact that the old covenant won't get us to Jesus. That's absolutely true. That the old covenant will not save us. That's absolutely true. But we can't read the law as this expectation of perfection put on God's people that they can never measure up to, so it's just this kind of cruel standard. That's not the case at all. And in fact, what you'll see, and you should look for this, is that the I, as Paul's writing through Romans 7, is actually innocent. He's kind of vindicated. It's not him that does the wrong, it's something else. And so I want you to look for that, and I want to hear from you. Just kind of what you think. If you have any questions, or if I can make anything more clear. All right, dive in. Right after this, there will be a discussion between Pastor Ben and myself, just kind of the way that we have seen or we resonate with the spiritual struggle that Paul's describing in Romans 7. I'd advise that you not watch it yet. Maybe you read Romans 7 yourself first once or twice, and then give it a watch after. All right, blessings. See you next week for Romans 8. So we're actually going to be in Romans 7 today. And I wanted to talk with you about a couple of ideas present in Romans 7, or a couple of pieces of Romans 7. So the one that I think is the biggest, and we'll just kind of start talking about it and see what kind of conversation nuggets come out of it. Mm-hmm. But the verse 14 to 20 is this, what appears to be like a monologue by Paul, where he talks about, I'm unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. I don't understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And there's a big question about, is this Paul talking about himself, or is it Paul like as a stand-in for Israel? But right. what I'm actually going to talk about in the video is that I think it's a both and rather than an either or. And so I think that this has a, if we look at it through the lens of our spiritual walk, like what it is to be a person wrestling with sin, just kind of what comes out of that. Do you relate to the passage? Do you feel like you don't relate to it? What is that struggle like for you? So looking at the verses through the lens of like it being autobiographical 14. From Paul, 14 to 20, 14 to 24, I guess, or 25. Do you relate to it? And if so, like, what's this process? I mean, is it something like your experience? Is it very different from your experience? So I'll talk about it for myself for a little bit. Maybe that'll be helpful. So like, especially here with verse 15, I don't understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And I feel like that sentence in particular has a lot of traction with my wrestling with spiritual formation and following Jesus. This struggle with sin where we know the good we want, but what we find is the thing we don't want to do, we end up caught up in again and again and again.
Yeah, and so I think everybody on the planet has, well, maybe not, but has experiences of like, we obviously have ideals for ourselves, like the things that we want to live up to, expectations of our community, the values that we have, and we all fall short of even our own Torah, and yet it's not bad. Obviously, it's not bad for individuals to have, kind of an ideal behavior, an ideal state of themselves to aspire to. And yet, like it's that gap between the standard or the ideal and then our actual behavior that is caused by sin.
Yeah. Well, I think that, the goal for us Christians is Jesus, right? We want to be like him. And one of the best proofs of something like a sin nature is the fact that we can have this ideal. We see this picture of compassion, of love, of gentleness, of kindness, of goodness. And we aspire to be like him. And it takes us no time at all to find that even though we are trying not to let anger rule our heart, we can't just turn it off. Like the thing we hate or loathe or want to be done with or away from just grabs hold of us. And I think that term, like grab hold of, helps me because I sometimes think like I can have a good mindset, good intentions, my heart in the right place, 23 hours and 59 minutes a day, and still I'm going to find that at some point sin grabs a hold of me and I end up doing, saying, thinking about things that I ought not. I think that what Paul is saying here in Romans 7 is definitely something that we can all relate to. And that's why, as I read and studied, and there's basically three different major perspectives on the passage and what Paul is actually talking about. And I think that there's a both and between at least two of them, which is the autobiographical expression and the look of at Israel kind of coming to wrestling with the Torah. And it's just this really precious passage that I find to be very encouraging, that Paul seems to be wrestling with things in his own heart in many of the same ways I wrestle with things in my heart. Because we tend to assume that the apostles are like superheroes, right? And they were perfect. But I feel like Paul knows sin in his own heart the way I know sin in my own heart.
Yeah.
I find that comforting.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, yes. It is comforting.
So
I don't know. Comforting, I don't know. It's just for some reason I'm sticking on the word comforting, because in some ways it's not, because it's like, oh man, like we're all stuck. Like that's, I mean, in terms of the Me Too part of it, yes, that's comforting, and also like, which I think is part of why Paul ends that chapter the way he does, which of course the chapters weren't there originally, but it's just like he breaks off the thought. He's like, who will save me from this body of death?
Well, yeah, because I mean,
not Paul.
Well, the picture he paints is so relatable, but that's the issue. It's this trap we can't get out of. Like the picture in Romans 6 is of the two cities, right? There's the city of sin and death, or the kingdom of sin and death, and the kingdom of life and grace. And we are all stuck in the one, unable to get out of it without help. Jesus breaks the wall so we can escape with him, but on our own, no matter how good we want to be, we're actually stuck.
Well,
and that's
and I think that part of the really the trap part of that is the moment that you think that now it's about me following the rules and being good, like you actually are back in the city of sin. Like that's the real trick of it. It's like, nope, like it's, and after he's rescued you, like it's still not about scrupulously following the laws, or doing it right. It's like that's still not about that. Like you are back in slavery.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
And that's the trick, because it's about allegiance, right? But one of the things Paul says in Romans 6, and the hints are here in 7 as well, is that if my allegiance is to Jesus, then these things will be happening, right? I will behave like I belong in the kingdom of life, and I will stop behaving like I belong in the kingdom of death. But as soon as we think that the behavior is the point, that's the trap of sin. But that's a really hard line to walk. The line of, it's about allegiance, but allegiance means my behavior should change, but I can't believe it's about my behavior changing.
I mean, I think where I'm at with that is that in some way, like we need to I'm not saying we just shouldn't think about it, but that I don't know. I'm just like, like, you know what? It'll be all right. Like the Lord has a lot more patience for us than we do. You can't get more saved than saved, and I think that, and usually about like, well, but what stops us from just doing what? Well, you tell me what stops you. Well, your allegiance to Jesus. Like that's real or it's not. Will we still struggle with things? Absolutely. Will there be sins or patterns of behavior that hound us to the very shores of death? Yes. So I mean, it's.
Well, and I know we don't disagree about this, and you're not saying otherwise. There is also definitely an individual component to pursuing righteousness, right? Like it's the whole idea of our sermon series on imitation right now is that it's not just the individual or the community that are supposed to be involved in trying to be like Jesus. We're both, like there's a both and the thing I really like about what you said is what we need is a community around us that calls us out. If we're all striving to be like Jesus, if we're all striving to become like him, then, and we misstep, we forget because we're good at forgetting, or we get distracted because we're good at getting distracted. There's this momentum of the community, but also this buffer of the community. There's somebody to say, wait a second, you've just become a legalist. Like, it's not your job to go outside, look at people not wearing masks and call the cops. Like, you don't need to do that.
Right.
And I think that that's a really good thing for us to keep in mind, is that the community is supposed to be a part of our individual walk. So when people are like, do I need to be part of a church? Well, you don't need to be a part of a church to go to heaven, right? But fortunately, the Christian walk is so much more than about going to heaven. It's about this transformation and being part of a community. And so that's why we need the body.
Right. I think that I would, which I agree with all that. And I think that when people, like, I think if somebody were to ask the apostles, like, do I need to be part of a church to be a Christian? Like, I think they would struggle to even understand the question, you know.
All the categories there, yeah.
What? You know what I mean? Like, if you don't want to be part of a church, then why are you even here? Like, go, you know, like, and I mean, but yeah.
Can I be the bride without wanting to be in the bride? Can I separate myself away from the rest? Yeah.
And even that, right? It's like we come alongside people, we encourage them, we try and point them to the truth, you know, but like, we're not in charge, you know, changing their behavior, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Very neat. Well, Ben, I think this is great. I was going to have us talk about the law, but I think that what we just did is about the right length for the end of a video, and I'll trim some of it, but I think most of it was really good. Well, yeah, I guess I will let you go then. Thank you very much.